The class suit being brought against World, English and Welsh Rugby Federations by a reported 185 players hit the headlines this week as the firm representing the players are reported to issue proceedings before the week is up. The case involves a group of rugby players diagnosed with early-onset dementia and other irreversible neurological impairments. The argument is that sports governing bodies were negligent in taking reasonable action to protect players from permanent injury caused by repetitive concussive and subconcussive blows. Joining us now to discuss this from a medical perspective is Dr. Johann Smart, who is a member of the Neurological Association of South Africa. A very good evening and welcome to Newzroom Afrika, Doctor.
Good evening and thank you for having me.
We've seen something like a class suit in sport before with the NFL. Rugby players, mainly in England, Wales, mainly in Europe, now getting involved to take on World Rugby and their own national federations. What do you make of this?
Yes, well, one should separate the legal perspective from what actually happens in terms of concussive head injury, which is quite common in sport, and rugby being a contact sport where this occurs commonly. The concern being that concussion is a common type of injury, and in this instance the concern is that concussion can lead to long-term neurological problems such as dementia. It's a controversial issue in terms of the legal aspect, but not in terms of the medical aspect, because it certainly looks as if repetitive concussion can lead to long-term cognitive problems in many people.
Doctor, that's something that the sports federations have been saying, that there's a growing body of evidence and nothing conclusive. Just today, new research by a team of international experts found that people playing contact sports such as American football, rugby and soccer face a dramatically elevated risk of developing degenerative brain diseases. The Concussion Legacy Foundation said analysis by experts at universities in the US, Australia, New Zealand, Brazil and Britain found this to be conclusive. This must be groundbreaking for any action taken against sporting bodies from a medical perspective, if they're saying that they've got conclusive evidence now of the impact of repetitive concussion.
Yes, and once again, I need to stress the fact that the legal arguments are very different from the medical arguments. So medical research is most definitely showing more and more evidence that repetitive concussion can lead to long-term changes, including cognitive decline. But that has been known for a long time in terms of boxing. The so-called punch-drunk syndrome has been known for many years. But most certainly it is now true that we see in many other sports that this also becomes an important aspect. The question is, which is often neglected in this sort of argument, is that one should remember that sports also has many positive aspects. And yes, most certainly there must be great care in terms of preventing concussion and concussion injuries as much as possible, and also acting when this happens in the correct way. But whether this is a precedent for a legal action and negligence on the part of the sporting body is a legal argument on which I will not comment.
Yeah. Doctor, let's speak a little bit more about concussion. I mean, there are a number of different sports where you will get a knock to the head. But can you just help us understand from a neurological point of view the severities of different concussions?
Yes. I think, you know, that in any sport, even sports like golf, you can have a golf club to the head. But certain sports most definitely is more likely to cause concussion syndromes. And it is a form of a head injury. And head injuries are normally classified as minor, mild to moderate, moderate and severe. And any degree of head injury can occur. So you can find that somebody in a boxing match or a rugby game can be knocked unconscious and can have significant head injury. But in the majority of instances, what you have is a minor concussive type of injury, where people might be dazed for a few moments, slightly off balance, and that might be then an indication of a mild brain injury. And the concern is that if you have repetitive injuries of this nature, in the long run, this can cause neurological deficits in patients when they get older.
How safe are our children?
Well, I think that the recognition of the fact that something like this exists is very important, because there is the issue that if somebody has a concussive injury, certain steps should be taken. Everything in life has got a certain degree of danger, and one should apply safety rules as much as possible. Unfortunately, as with most things in life, there is always a degree of risk. I think that if the rules are applied, and if children who have a concussive traumatic event is prevented from continuing with the game at hand, and also, if necessary, retired from the sport for some time, the risks are not significant. But the concern is very often that people get a concussive head injury and they continue playing and they sustain repetitive insults.
Yeah, that second impact syndrome is the really dangerous one that can lead to death. But concussions are also quite difficult, because you can't just go for an MRI scan or just have a scan to actually diagnose it. What should people actually look out for? Because some people may just be knocked to the ground and don't even realize that they have a concussion.
Yes, and it is said that, the majority of these syndromes, the diagnosis is made on clinical grounds rather than on special investigation. So, yes, it's nice to have an MRI, but an MRI might be completely normal. So the classical findings is if somebody gets an impact of any significance, because it's obvious in a rugby game you do get a bit of mild bumps. But if somebody gets a bump there must be an evaluation in terms of how well the patient is orientated, how well he understands what's going on. If there is any functional neurological deficit, meaning if there is any visual disturbance, if the patient feels dizzy or off balance, in that instance, there is a significant concussive injury and the patient should be retired from that game at that point. Furthermore, obviously, strict enforcement of the rules of games to prevent dangerous play is very important. And I think this is more and more being realized.
Yeah. Doctor, for parents, especially parents of high school boys whose reputations rest on them playing in a big derby match as a first-team player, often it does take the people closest to them to keep a very close eye to say, in actual fact, you're not okay, because perhaps sometimes the players don't want to admit that they may be having visual impairments or they may not be feeling 100% themselves. So what do the people closest to people who have concussions or potential concussions look out for?
Yeah, I think, that is obviously the big risk, and sometimes even the patients, the people closest to somebody who get injured are also involved to a level where they don't want their significant person to be injured, because they also want them to continue in that derby where they're playing. But it is important to realize that the short-term gain here will potentially result in long-term loss. So if somebody sees that there's any indication of somebody being slightly confused, slightly irritated, slightly acting in a different way than they would normally do, then it is important to retire them from the match. But it is also important that in the bigger kind of matches, there should be medical personnel with some degree of training to have basic neurological evaluation of the patient available on the side of the field, so that if there's any concern, rather sit out. Don't continue. Don't risk it.
Do we have that kind of expertise in a sport where this is a problem, like rugby here in South Africa?
Yes, I think that it obviously depends on the level, but I think that even in school sport, anybody with a degree of training in emergency help or first help that should be available there must have an understanding how to evaluate very basic things in terms of neurological function. And that needs not be very difficult. It can be just basic things to evaluate orientation, the ability to speak normally, the ability to keep your balance, And that should be sufficient to realize whether there is any problem that needs further evaluation.
You mentioned something very important, and that is, as much as we need to understand the risks, we also need to appreciate the benefits of sport. You are often posed with these questions, I'm sure, about the safety of a sport such as rugby, or one where concussions are seen, and some parents just saying, well, I don't want my children to partake. However, that may not be the right way to deal with something like this.
I think it is true that one should always evaluate the risk, and I think sports like boxing has fallen out of favor in many instances because of the relative concern about trauma. But it is also true that there is a lot of benefit in terms of the actual physical activity related to sport, but also the team spirit and everything else that goes with it. And therefore, I think one should not necessarily be too overcritical or too overprotective with regard to the potential risks of any sporting activity, because there is a lot of good that comes from it too. But what is very important is that the administrations with regard to the sport should be very strict. So rules should be applied very strictly. Dangerous approaches to the game should be stopped immediately, and any form of trauma with any degree of concern should be acted upon aggressively, because that's the way we make it safe.
Lovely stuff. Thank you, Dr. Johann Smart, chatting to us. He is a member of the Neurological Association of South Africa. We appreciate your time here on Newzroom Afrika.